Morning kids. Today we got this 2014 Street Glide. It come in with a problem. It's got a big block S&S 124 in it. After a few years of having a lot of fun, it's got a little tick in the motor that comes and goes a little bit. So we're going to start out by seeing if we can replicate that sound. We're going to warm it up in the shop, have a fan blowing really hard on the motor, and see if we can get that tick to come and go as the customer described it, and we'll start from there. So, when we had this engine running, what we used to listen, because sound is caused by vibration, you use either a screwdriver, you put it tightly to your ear, and the other end, you put it on whatever you're listening to. And we also have a special mechanic stethoscope. This piece here takes out the higher pitch frequencies, I believe, but works really good if you're trying to listen to something. If you don't have a stethoscope, use a big screwdriver. That'll work great, sometimes better than a stethoscope. So on this bike, after listening to it, we feel it's a collapsed piston. But we're going to start by taking the tank and the exhaust off once it's cooled off, and open up the cam chest and start from there. We're going to drain the oil, pull open the cam chest, have a look in there, because that's always the cheapest place to start, and then we're going to pull the top end off as well. Tank, pretty straightforward. 2 bolts back here, 2 bolts on the front, and a slide collar on your petcock to pop it. Pretty easy to take off. You got a T40 Torx down here with a 1/2-inch nut. And then you pop your lid off here. There's 2 7/16 nuts holding the cap off. 2 7/16 nuts on the front, and then your fairing lower comes right out. Do the same on both sides. Then you have nice, clean, easy access to your motor. For the floorboards, there's a 5/16 Allen and a 9/16 wrench. Pull both bolts out, and then we'll take the rear floorboards off. Now that everything's cooled off enough that we can touch it to work on, we're going to drain the oil out of it. This guy's got a Thundermax EFI module in it, so you're going to want to make sure you go underneath and cut all your zip ties off. Unplug your 2 sensors, the 2 in the front end. Rear goes off, 1/2-inch bolt back here, 15mm nut here. Most exhaust system mounting brackets are pretty similar. There's always going to be a support plate underneath the tranny here, or coming off the bottom of the motor somewhere. This one has a carriage bolt with the 9/16 nut on the bottom. Last thing left to do, you got 2 nuts at the head on a flange. They're a 1/2-inch nut. Take those off for the rear one and the front one. Then you can carefully wiggle your exhaust off. All right, just had a little lunch here. So now we're going to pull these air deflectors off. Air filter, throttle body, unplug all that stuff. Here's another sad bike with an open air cleaner. You can see, I don't know if you can see on the camera, it's full of fine dirt inside the air filter, as well as inside the throttle body. Anytime you run an open air cleaner like this, always run a sock on it. If you don't, and I built the motor for you, there's no warranty. Now we're going to pull this cam cover off and see what comes out of there. We're going to need a rubber hammer. So far at first glance, I don't see any aluminium or metal coming out of the bottom. We're going to pull our O-rings off, put those back in the cover, and then we'll start opening up this oil pump. This is a proprietary oil pump from S&S. Pull this oil pump and stuff off. We're going to pull this cam plate, or this air filter backing plate off, get it out of the way, take our push rods out to relieve our lifters. Pretty easy to take off. You got 2 bolts through your breathers, and you got 3 standoff bolts through your plate into the throttle body. Now we're going to unplug all our sensors. Some of them have a little yellow security clip on. You got to release first. O2 sensors, we're going to unplug them. Your Allen bolts out. It helps if you have a 1/4-inch ball end Allen. You want to take the 9/16 bolts out of the front head. Take your front top motor mount out. So now we're going to pop these push rods out. You need a little flat screwdriver. And just pull the top retaining plate out. You can slide your lower tube out. And then you're going to take, I think on this one, it's 7/16 wrench. Just loosen the retaining nut. And take your quickie push rods out. Unfortunately, this motor does not have a quickie push rod. So we're going to have to pull the valve covers off and the rocker box lower halves. Once you got all 6 rocker box cover bolts out, you might have to tap them loose with a rubber hammer and pull those covers off. Once you get the bolts out of your rocker blocks, pop them out, pull your push rods out, and make sure that you lay them in order the way they came out so that everything goes back together and in the same spot that it's worn into. It's important to put parts back into the place that they were worn into, because if you were to reassemble them and mix them up, then you get even more faster premature wear. Now we're going to go around, loosen all these Allen screws on the SNS oil pump, pull the outer plate out. Make sure you don't drop this spring, and there's a ball bearing in there. Also, there's an O-ring here you're going to want to save. Take your 1/2-inch bolt out of your pinion gear. Pop the rest of your gears off carefully. Just hook them, yank them off. Once you get your cam support plate out, make sure you inspect the lobes on your camshaft for any wear or any grooving like that. Any signs of any hard surfacing peeling off. If there's any at all, replace them. Have a look at your lifters, the wheels on them. Keep an eye on which hole they came out of. My personal rule is I never put used lifters back into a motor. Lifters are one of the most important things on a Harley engine. If they don't fit properly in the bore here, they're either going to seize up, or if they're loose, you're going to lose oil pressure. So sometimes when I build a motor, I got 3 different size lifters in one engine to make sure that you have the optimal oil pressure and oil flow to the top end. When you're loosening your head bolts, always loosen them in a crisscross pattern instead of one side at a time. There's less chance of head warpage if you loosen them at a crisscross pattern. It's nice that when we got these rocker boxes off, we can see that there's no broken valve springs. These beehive valve springs, sometimes you get a top coil that'll bust off. Important when you're taking this engine apart, don't throw anything away until you're done reassembling this engine. Make sure you measure the thickness of your head gaskets. Probably going to use the same thickness, I highly suggest it. And I'm going to rinse this all off really good before we pull the cylinders off so that no dirt falls inside the crankcase. You can see how these pistons are gold all the way down past the rings. That means that these rings have been allowing for a lot of blow-by on this engine. To pull these pins out, you just take a little pick. Carefully, while you're wearing a pair of eyeglasses for protection, you pry that little C-clip out of there. Now that we've got our top end off, we've got everything cleaned up really well. We're going to put a dial indicator gauge on the pinion end of our crank. Check our crankshaft run out before we do any more work. Hopefully you guys can see that dial indicator gauge there. So with only a couple thou run out on the pinion shaft and the rods feeling good up on the top and on the bottom, at least we don't have to disassemble this bottom end. There you can see that's the front of the rear cylinder. All this vertical scoring, and you can see how yellow the cylinder is really. That's called burnishing. So these cylinders need to be redone. The scoring doesn't feel too thick, so we should be able to clean that with next size over pistons, but we'll have to put a set of torque plates on there and check them out first. Now we're going to pull our primary cover off as well. Good idea to inspect everything in there when you're building an engine. Now I've heard lots of guys say, oh, these automatic tensioners, they're no good to run. They get too tight. Take out your tranny bearings or your main bearings. Well, here we just pulled the cover off and we haven't done nothing. And I'd say that's right within spec on slot. Alright folks, thanks for watching. Once you get everything cleaned up, make sure you wrap everything really good in the bag. You don't want any dirt or dust in there. Before we put this engine back together, we'll pull the oil pan off, clean it out and flush it. We'll replace the oil cooler on the front because you never know what gets trapped in there and you can never flush them properly. So when we get some stuff back from head porting and machining, then we will show you how to reassemble this engine properly to our standards. Anyways, have a great night and we'll talk to you soon.